As I understand, you guys are having these monthly, is it?
Sorry?
You guys are having these sessions on a monthly basis, is it?
Yes.
Okay, all right. That's good to know. And do you guys have a set list of topics, or do you just let the sort of psychologist or the expert come in with a topic they suggest?
We have generally, basis on the month which is going on. So something like last month, it was appraisal time. So we did something to deal with appraisal. So we look at what kind of things would interest people. And depending on that, we bring in experts. Of course, there are times when we find very good people doing a particular subject and which could be new for us. So we explore that. So we are open.
Okay, all right, that's great to hear. And I got to know about you guys through Unnati, who I've liaised with. So it's lovely to kind of, reach out to these areas which exist, but it's great to, finally kind of meet all of you and know that this is happening. So, yeah.
I will be displaying this screen, which Ankita sent me. So give me 1 minute to bring that up.
While you bring that up, can I start admitting people, Samantha, and go live?
Yes. All right, I think we are live and we can get started. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming in and joining us for this interesting conversation about managing personal and professional boundaries. We have today Dr. Miloni. Just give me 1 minute. I'm trying to do something here. So welcome, Dr. Miloni Sanghvi Vakil. Thank you for taking the time out.
Hello. Good evening, madam.
Hi, I think Smita.
This is HK Parekh from GNFC.
Could we just give her a minute to log back in?
Am I audible, madam?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think if we could just start, I'll run you through a quick introduction of our speaker for today, Dr. Miloni Sanghvi Vakil. She's a consultant psychologist with extensive experience in different settings, including the NHS, hospitals, schools, and private clinics. She specializes in working with youth and young adults and has a particular interest in migration research. And the psychological impact of social media. Her expertise covers a wide range of issues, including depression, anxiety, trauma, relationship conflict, stress, and bereavement. She utilizes evidence based approaches like CBT, compassion focused therapy, existential psychotherapy, person centered therapy, and psychodynamic therapy. With over 10 years of experience, she continuously updates her skills to provide effective treatment. Today, Dr. Miloni will be talking to us about how to manage personal and professional boundaries. Welcome, Dr. Miloni.
Thank you so much, Ankita, and I will take it from there. So thank you for that generous introduction. It really is lovely to hear such kind words. Thank you for that. And thank you to all of you for joining today, joining in this afternoon to have a discussion around boundaries. So as Ankita beautifully introduced and kindly introduced, I am Dr. Miloni Sanghvi Vakil. And just before I put up the PowerPoint presentation, I wanted to share that this topic of boundaries is one that I wanted to present, I wanted to talk about and discuss today because it's something that is so prominent and I see so much in my professional work for sure. I've had my own journey with navigating healthy boundaries. So there's a bit of that might come in as well. But it's definitely one that I see in my practice quite a bit. So I thought it might be quite an appropriate topical issue to tackle today. And if you give me a moment, I will just start sharing the presentation. So I'll just put it up. And okay. I believe we can see this. Yeah, okay, I'm getting some nods. Thank you for that help there. And so, yes, we'll be looking at managing personal and professional boundaries. Now, just some considerations before we jump into the topic that do keep yourselves on mute while I'm presenting to avoid disturbances. I would love to hear your voices later, but for the duration of the presentation, I think this might be helpful. Have your videos on, it's completely optional, but it's pleasant to see your faces and have your responses and feedback even through your expressions. I see some of you here already, so thank you for having your videos on. We will have some time for questions at the end. I'll try give around sort of 10-15 minutes to discuss. Do have a pen and paper or sort of a digital screen document where you can perhaps jot down some ideas or reflections as we're going through. Now, remember that today is a space for us to discuss, explore, understand, experiment. So there's no pressure to have things right, to know the answers. It's a space for all of us to get together and discuss and sort of think about this topic together. Every time I run these presentations and workshops, I take back a lot with me as well. So I myself am learning. And that's an opportunity you guys provide me with. And remember, the more you give, the more you will get out of this process. So it's up to you how involved, how sort of withdrawn. If you want to take a backseat, that's entirely up to you. If you're just here to listen, if you want to actually engage in these activities, entirely up to you. Now, what are you hoping to gain out of this discussion today? I want you to take just a minute to reflect on what you are hoping to gain out of this discussion. And I did mention that you can be involved, you can be commenting, you can be sharing, or you can take a back seat and just be learning, observing. Absolutely fine. But just take a moment to think about what are you hoping to gain out of this discussion on managing personal and professional boundaries today. If you like, perhaps make a note of it. And I'm just going to open up the chat as well. I see people joining in from all over, so that's wonderful. Now, moving on, today we're going to look at these key areas, understanding boundaries, the different types of boundaries we have, what do we need to know about boundary setting, and tips to better implement healthy boundaries in the workplace. Now, while I was discussing with the organizers of this workshop, I did get a lot of feedback that there is this need and this demand to understand how to implement healthy boundaries. So we'll look at that. And of course, being a psychologist, one of my favorite words, emotions, we'll be looking at emotions related to boundaries. Now, let's start with what is a boundary? How do we define boundary? Anyone want to have a go? You want to say it out? You want to put it into the chat? How do we define a boundary? If we have cricket fans here, you'll definitely know what a boundary is. There's one definition of that. So. I guess we'll just warm up into it. And
It's just to understand when to stop when to stop, or what, mostly when to stop, what are the limits to
Great.
do, like do's and don'ts.
Fantastic.
It could be a point where somebody can't cross the line.
Yes. Thank you for sharing those inputs. We heard limit, where to stop, crossing a line. Absolutely. I'm seeing in the chat, there's setting limits, the line of control, what is acceptable, what is not. We also heard the do's and don'ts. Absolutely. End of process, right? Time to stop doing, being okay and not okay. Great. These are fantastic responses. And I think you've done a fantastic job at defining boundary, perhaps better than Oxford Dictionary here, which says a line, a boundary is a line which marks the limits of an area, a dividing line. And again, for the cricket fans here, we'll know that the boundary is sort of marking the end of the field, and anything that crosses the boundary, depending on how it does, is either a 4 or a 6. And so, yes, it is a line, a limit. Now, when we talk about limit, it's the limit on a cricket field to the area, but it can be a limit to our capacity, to our ability, to what we can tolerate. As many of you have said, what is okay, what is not okay, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. So definitely we have this definition of a boundary, and we have different types of boundaries. So what we'll do is we'll just go through the different types of boundaries that can exist in various contexts, from your personal life, your social life, to your professional life. So let's start with that. We have, first of all, time boundaries. Now, time boundaries refer to how a person uses their time. And when a person has healthy time boundaries, they are setting aside enough time for each facet of their life. For example, spending enough time at work, spending enough time with your family, having enough time to have a social life, dedicating that time to your hobbies, to travel, for instance. And that's having that balance. Setting aside the time for things that are important to you is having healthy time boundaries. Now, a violation of a time boundary for yourself may be when you're dedicating too much time to one facet and not being able to pay attention to the other things that matter. It's also violated when somebody else demands too much of your time and not respecting somebody else's time. Now, I, having lived in Europe for most of my life, punctuality is a very important factor in my life. And having moved to India around 3.5 years ago, I have learned the hard way that meeting at 8 p.m. means meeting at 9 p.m. sometimes. But that was a time boundary that I had to get used to. And initially, 8 p.m. meant, okay, 8:05 acceptable, 8:15 p.m. not acceptable. So, it's thinking about respecting somebody else's time as well. Then we have physical boundaries. Now, physical boundaries refers to personal space as well as physical touch. So similarly, I have this example of being in Europe where your physical space, you have much more physical space around you. Something as simple as queuing up, standing in a line. There's generally at least 50 centimeters between me and the person in front of me, and 50 centimeters behind the person behind me. But I've learned again the hard way that physical space boundary doesn't exist so much in this culture. And that's just sort of adjusting, thinking about what is acceptable, where's the limit, where do we draw the line? In terms of physical touch, it's a very common one that comes up, being aware of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of touch. Thinking about the workplace, a handshake, maybe a gentle hug, okay. Thinking about more intimate ways of touching, such as a peck on the cheek, coming up too close, may not be appropriate for the work setting. So where do we draw that line? That's something for us to think about, and also respecting somebody else's physical boundary here. Also thinking about personal space. When you go to somebody's house, for instance, you'll go to the living room, you'll be in the dining area, but you don't generally just walk into their personal bedroom or start looking through the cupboards. That is a violation of physical space as well. So just thinking about what's appropriate if you're accessing somebody else's work, somebody's books, somebody's locker, thinking about that physical boundary and, hey, maybe I just want to request this person if this is okay, or inform them. So that's respecting the person's physical boundary. Then we have emotional boundaries. This refers to a person's feelings, and healthy emotional boundaries include limitations on when to share and when not to share personal information. For example, gradually sharing personal information during the development of a relationship is healthy as opposed to revealing everything at once. We all may know people who tend to overshare, and that's not having a healthy boundary. That's not placing an emotional boundary there. Also, crossing an emotional boundary may be when somebody is experiencing something and you start giving advice, or you start sort of engaging with that information when it may not be comfortable for that other person. So just thinking about staying within bounds, staying within a comfortable bound, and communication will always help navigate this boundary, which I will come to later on. Then there's financial or material boundaries. This refers to money and possessions, and healthy material boundaries involve setting limits on what you will share, what you are able to give out, and with whom. So, for instance, if a bunch of colleagues are going for lunch or dinner and you feel this place is a bit pricey, let's say a Starbucks, you know, they have a coffee, let's say on average 300 rupees. And if they're doing that every second day, that does add up, and you may not be comfortable with that. So we may draw a boundary there and not give into that peer pressure, or, you know, that friend making a comment of, hey, why don't you join? You know, we're just going for a coffee. Wait a second, that's crossing my comfort zone. That's crossing a financial boundary. Also, something like lending a possession. For example, if a colleague says, hey, I really need to use a car, use your car, borrow your car. You may not be comfortable with that. You may lend it to a family member, but not to some colleagues. So just thinking about where your boundaries lie. I am running through these different types of boundaries, but if there are any questions or you want me to go slower, please do just unmute yourself or put it on the chat and let me know. But there's a lot of information to cover, and I've tried to kind of cover the key aspects of it. So moving on to the next ones, there's intellectual boundaries. This refers to thoughts and ideas, and healthy intellectual boundaries include respecting others' ideas. Sure, express yours, but acknowledge that there may be a difference. You may not agree, and you want to respect others' ideas, others', let's say, political or philosophical stances as well. And you may set a boundary as to what's appropriate. You don't want to set out into an argument at your workplace over an intellectual topic. So setting that boundary, you may say something like, I know we disagree, but we'll just have to respect that we have different opinions here. And that's setting a healthy boundary. And then there's sexual boundaries. Now, this is one that refers to the emotional, intellectual, and physical aspects of a sexual relationship. And it's having a mutual understanding and respect for what the limitations and desires are in usually a romantic relationship between sexual partners. However, violation of sexual boundaries may also look like making sexual comments, and we may think they're harmless, but actually they can be doing harm. So just being aware of what we're saying, what we're doing, how we're interacting, and is it disrespectful or uncomfortable for someone? Then we have religious and spiritual boundaries. So that refers to you may express your religious beliefs or religious ideas, but you may not express so much of your religious identity, let's say in a professional context, where again, we have people coming from all over. You definitely don't want to impose your beliefs and thoughts and expect the other person to also agree with you completely. So there may be a religious or spiritual boundary that we have to draw. And then finally on this list is the non-negotiables. Now this is completely varied. It can exist in the various types of various domains that I have just presented. For example, a non-negotiable at work, maybe I can absolutely not take any phone calls or respond to any emails on a Sunday, or maybe even on a Saturday, or I have to leave the workplace by 6:30 p.m. because my child is with family and I have to pick them up. So there may be a time aspect to it. there may be a religious aspect to it of, I'm sorry, I'm not comfortable buying you that, that chicken, I'm a vegetarian, for instance, and being able to express that rather than feeling coerced into something that, that you're not comfortable doing, right? Okay. So why are these boundaries important? Well, we have this diagram here that shows the mental, emotional, and physical benefits for the self. We have that it promotes autonomy, it gives you a sense of command, a sense of control of your actions and decisions. It wards off burnout, improves emotional health, improves relationships. It sets clear expectations for others, but even for yourself, it makes you think. It decreases stress, improves self-care abilities and capabilities, and actually, helps you gain respect from others as well as grow your own self-respect. So there are definitely a range of benefits to placing healthy boundaries. But if we think about not placing boundaries, we might see the inverse of this. You may feel overwhelmed or burned out. You may feel a sense of lack of control. You may not be engaging in self-care. Others may simply not know because you haven't communicated the boundaries. So yes, there's the downside to not having boundaries as well. Now, they're important because you want to communicate where you sit, where you stand, how you're positioned. If you don't speak, the other person is not going to know. So it's really important to communicate. As we mentioned, to build clarity. When you're setting a boundary, it actually makes you think. It makes you think, hey, what am I comfortable with? What am I not comfortable with? What am I okay to compromise? Where is my non-negotiable? It helps you build that clarity. It helps promote equality and fairness in the relationship, in the workplace, between colleagues, between the manager and the employee. And finally, boundaries are really important because they help you stand up for yourself. And again, this is about confidence, this is about self-respect, as well as respect from others. So a lot of benefits, a lot of reasons why we want to have healthy boundaries in place. Now, just a few questions I want to put out there. I'll perhaps just give you 2 minutes to have some thoughts that come up, maybe jot down some ideas. But when have you been uncomfortable or unable to say no to someone? Perhaps it's in the workplace, perhaps it's outside of the workplace. But when has it been uncomfortable for you to say no? Are your boundaries different in personal settings versus professional settings? And if so, which ones? Are there particular people that you find it difficult to set boundaries with? Or in what context do you find it difficult to set boundaries? Again, it might be being unable to say no. And on the contrary, when have you managed to set some healthy boundaries? What are you proud of? What has felt good that, yes, I was able to do this? Remember, it's not just about what you aren't able to do, but it's also thinking about what you have done and what we've learned from that. And so I'll just give you perhaps a minute with these questions to reflect on, to ponder on, maybe to jot down some notes. If you have any reflections you want to share in the chat, please do feel free to do so. Great, the power of saying no is the more powerful weapon, definitely. I see that in the chat. Thank you for sharing that. So we have a question on LinkedIn. What are our limitations in a given particular scenario? It's interesting we're talking about limitations here because the limitations will be both external and internal. I will come to this topic in more depth a bit later on, but the question is not what are our limitations, but really who sets these limitations, where are they coming from, and how do we navigate those? So I will come to that later on. And if we're okay, I have one more in the chat box. Many times in personal surroundings, it becomes difficult to say no because of the relationships. Absolutely, this is a fantastic point. it's difficult in our personal settings. You don't want to upset the people, but you still want to stand up for yourself. How do we navigate that? Difficult to set boundaries. I'm just reading again in the chat, difficult to set boundaries in a professional setting than personal setting, maybe because of the risks involved of power play, definitely. We'll come to this as well. Subtle no is also taken otherwise as generally setting boundaries is considered extremely rude. Absolutely. You may be called rude or demanding or uncaring. So that's something that we have to navigate when dealing with boundaries. When someone asking bribe from government official, okay, that's one that I haven't had experience with yet, but setting a boundary there definitely comes into the picture. There's a question here, what would you recommend for those who are not respecting the boundaries? Okay, so absolutely fantastic question. This is talking about how others respond to your boundary setting. We'll come to this later on when we talk about tips around boundary setting as well. More often difficult with close family members like children or partner. Absolutely, because there's the emotional component that comes in. Thank you so much for these reflections. I will move on from here and we will come to a lot of these points and questions later on in the presentation. We have one here, clients calling you after office hours is violation of boundaries. Absolutely. And that is one that I think many of us have experienced. I have heard about this in my professional practice. I've experienced it myself as well. So we'll come to the tips of how to navigate this, but thank you very much for these reflections. And it's lovely to share these because I think it brings a sense of togetherness. It's like, oh, wow, you faced that as well. So have I. And it really shows how much there is a need for boundaries here as well. Okay, now I am a big Bollywood buff, even if I have this sort of American accent going. I love Bollywood. I do speak a bit of Hindi, I promise. And we have this scene from Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum where Amitabh Bachchan's character says, it's often to Jaya Bachchan saying, "Keh diya na, bas keh diya." And he's setting a very firm boundary. What happens in the scene after this is Jaya Bachchan is left speechless. She's unable to say anything. That boundary has been set. No, that's it. No change, nothing. So that is a very rigid boundary. And it's not just about setting a boundary, but it's about setting a healthy boundary. So if I'm sure a lot of you have watched this scene, how do you think Jaya Bachchan felt when she heard this? So Amitabh Bachchan, I think his name was Yashvardhan Raichand, he sets this boundary, "Keh diya na, bas keh diya." How does that make Jaya Bachchan feel? I felt really sorry for her. Bullied, absolutely. Stunned, shocked. Yeah, these are fantastic emotional responses that you're able to identify. Belittled, yeah, she felt belittled. She felt like she didn't have a voice. She felt speechless. Absolutely fantastic. So we're talking about how placing a very rigid boundary is also unhelpful. It's too strong. It's not respecting the other person's voice. No equal rights, exactly. There isn't that equality. Now, on the contrary, we have ignored one last one. I'm going to put up another character from another Bollywood movie. One of my favorite ones is Rajpal Yadav in Hungama. I can't remember his character name at all, but this is a scene where everybody's just sort of hitting him for no reason. And he says, "Hum koi mandir ka ghanta hai ke koi bhi aake baja jata hai," right? And he's talking about how everybody's just hitting him and he's taking that abuse from people and he's feeling fed up. How do you feel if you've watched this scene in Hungama, how do you feel for Rajpal Yadav in this scene? I felt very sorry for him. Angry, bullied, again. Yes. I take it many of you have watched these movies and are familiar with these scenes, but here, what Rajpal Yadav is talking about is the lack of boundaries or very open boundaries. That, what do you think I am? I'm going to accept anything. I'm going to tolerate anything. You know, you feel sorry for him. You feel angry. It's uncomfortable. You feel sad for him. There's this emotional abuse, this invasion of his space. Absolutely taken for granted. Exactly. And I think that expression shows exactly that. So thank you for sharing these. So again, the topic is not just about boundaries, but it's about healthy boundaries. And we have here the rigid boundaries that we saw in Amitabh Bachchan. We saw the very open and porous boundaries, like a sponge with lots of holes, very permeable in Rajpal Yadav. And we see healthy boundaries. Now, when we talk about healthy boundaries, we are placing importance on our own views. We do not compromise on our values. We have an awareness of what we want and need, and we can communicate them. So it's not just identifying the wants and needs, but being able to express that as well. That's where we're setting a healthy boundary. We share information in an appropriate way. So again, in a work setting, think about how much personal information you're willing to share. Where do you draw that boundary? What topics do you discuss? What's off the table? And being able to say no and being able to accept when others say no to you. So both the ability to say no and draw that boundary, but also a healthy boundary is when you're respecting. A healthy boundary is when you're able to accept when others say no to you. And earlier in the chat, somebody said, what do you do when somebody else doesn't accept your boundary? Well, that's a reflection of their unhealthy boundary, perhaps. So I got a comment here that movie and real life is different. Yes, absolutely right. This was just a depiction of through characters, but yes, it's it's much more emotional and difficult when you're experiencing it for yourself. Now, with the rigid boundaries, when we see a very kind of hard, stubborn stance, you're unlikely or unable to ask for help. You may be struggling internally, but you can't express that. You keep away from intimacy and close relationships. You maintain very few close relationships. You may come across as detached, even with a romantic partner. That's what we saw in this case with Amitabh Bachchan. He was seeming very detached, not seeming to respect what she had to say or what she was feeling. Very private, reserved, protective of personal information, and maintaining distance from others, often to avoid rejection. And on the contrary, very open boundaries. You have a tendency of oversharing information. You have a difficulty in saying no to others. You allow yourself to be disrespected or abused. And when I say allow, you're not always saying, do this to me, but it might be difficult. You might find it difficult to actually stop that and place a boundary. There may be an over-involvement in others' problems. You may constantly be seeking reassurance from others, seeking opinions of others, again, not having a stance on your own views and values. And you often fear rejection by others, and therefore you tend to give in to others' demands or requests. So we want to sort of focus on this middle space of healthy boundaries. That's where we want to be. And again, the role of culture and context plays a big role, is a significant factor here. The boundaries in Indian versus Western cultures will be very different. As I expressed my own experience, that in Western cultures, I found that people are more protective of their physical space. They're more able to vocalize that. In the Indian culture, especially in Mumbai, where I live, there is more sort of closeness, sharing of personal space that might be difficult for some. It definitely was for me to navigate earlier, but it's just acknowledging that there are differences. There are differences in how you navigate, your office setting versus with friends, how those boundaries come out there. And we saw in a lot of your reflections that some found it difficult to set boundaries with close ones. Others found it difficult to set them in professional settings. And then there's the formal versus informal, similar to office versus friends, but there might be a more formal context, such as a meeting or a conference you're going to, versus informal, going to a restaurant with friends or a club or so on. And you may find other contexts or cultures where you'll find these differences as well. Now, here's just a little comic. I tend to draw a few comics, and here's one on healthy boundaries, where we have an individual who's having a party or so, and he goes, you both have to be there, not taking no for an answer, almost putting that pressure for these two ladies to be there. One with not such, perhaps not the healthiest boundaries goes, oh, sure, we'll let you know. And we often tend to do this. We'll let you know. I'll think about it. Okay, we'll catch up on it. Yeah, I'll respond later. And then there's this confident one with her healthy boundaries, very aware of them, saying, thanks, man, not tomorrow. I need to take the weekend off for myself. anyway, enjoy your night. And her friend's just going, whoa, that was very confident and very assertive of you. And that's perhaps the place we want to reach as well, depending on the context. So how do we get that? How do we place these healthy boundaries? Well, placing healthy boundaries begins with knowledge and identification. So know your limits and set your limits. Before entering or becoming involved in a situation, know what's acceptable for you and what isn't, and be as specific as possible when you are setting these limits. Now, know that these limits will be different for each individual. For instance, I gave this example of a parent having to pick up the child from a relative's place. Your limit is working until 6:30 p.m. and then you have to leave. Another limit may be, I'm happy to talk about my husband on a surface level, but I'm not going to discuss, our everyday situations at home. I'm not going to take that to the work context, for instance. A limit you may set in your personal context may also be, I'm not going to talk about work too much. I might say, yeah, it's going well, or I'm finding it a bit difficult, but just navigating, but that's about it. I'm not going to make this whole conversation about my professional life, for instance. So know your limits, know what's acceptable and what isn't, and be as specific as possible. That really, brings values into place, because every person's limits are different and they're often determined by your values. For example, if you really want to focus on your family life, your limits may be different, but let's say your value for the next few years is financial security. You might actually let go of some of these limits and work longer hours. You might stick to that job that is putting a lot of pressure on you because that value is different. So it's really important to define your values. And if we have some time later on, I will show you an activity that we can do to really define our values and identify what's most important to us. Now, planning ahead, definitely before entering a conversation or a confrontation, think about what you're going to say, think about what's respectful, and a bit of planning always helps. What I tend to tell my clients when I'm working on boundary setting is write down a few points, a few prompts that can help you navigate and focus the conversation. Often what we see is when we're setting a boundary, it can go off on an emotional tangent, but you did this, but you did that, you don't even see. These prompts bring you back to the point to be discussed. It keeps you focused. It keeps the conversation focused. Then we have understand what your feelings are trying to tell you and listen to them. Often you might feel feelings of discomfort or resentment when we don't have a healthy boundary in place, and don't bury them, don't ignore them. They might be telling you something. For example, if you're resenting something, that may be traced to a feeling of being taken advantage of or being manipulated. So your feelings are telling you something, and do listen to them. Now, also remember to be assertive and use confident body language. So do use very assertive, clear language, yes, no, rather than the maybe, let you know. Use confident body language. So use a tone and a pace that is comfortable to understand, maintain eye contact, smile occasionally, have an open, confident posture rather than sort of a crippled posture. Now, even the body language is very important. You don't want to come across as shy and speak very low, and this can make you seem very underconfident and being taken advantage of, versus I'm very confident in what I'm saying and I would like to express this message. So just think about how you're using that space with your body, with your voice, your tone, your language. I've got a question here. Could you give an example of a prompt, please? So that's in terms of planning ahead. Let's say you're going to talk to your parent about how you want to set a particular boundary in terms of them messaging you, right? And you're planning this conversation in your head. A prompt might be a situation. Every time I go out, this is what is acceptable, this is what's not acceptable. You may You may write that prompt down so that if the conversation gets emotional, the mom says, but I've done so much for you, and you don't even recognize it. How can you be so demanding? How can you not understand? Okay, mom, I understand all of that. That's a different conversation we can have, but coming back to my point, when I'm going out. And so it helps you direct yourself to the point you're trying to make. I hope that answers your question. Coming back to the points we want to remember, be respectful to others while maintaining self-respect. So I use this term polite assertiveness. You want to be assertive and confident and clear, but you want to be polite. You don't want to be pointing fingers. You did this and you were terrible. That makes the other person feel uncomfortable and threatened. So you want to be mindful of that as well. But at the same time, you want to maintain that self-respect. You want to talk about what's going on for you. You want to also prioritize your needs while keeping the other's needs in mind. You may have to compromise. So while setting a boundary, again, let's say a time boundary, you have a project coming up. And you're working late nights. I think this is quite a common one I've heard. There's a project deadline coming up. You're working late hours. You have a time boundary, but you might say, okay, look, I cannot do this every day, but I understand the need here. I understand there's a deadline coming up. So I'm willing to stay back on Monday and Wednesday and be very clear about it, right? So that might be the compromise you make to understand and respect the other's needs, but also to hold your own boundary. And finally, think about the long-term outcome or goal. If you're constantly the one who's giving, there might be something that's off here. There's you not being respected, your boundaries not being respected. So zoom out and see, is this a give and take? Am I feeling equal here? Or is there something that feels off here? We may feel this in our personal relationships when you constantly try to do something for someone and that's not being reciprocated. That might be a violation of a boundary or a violation of sort of that respect and you being prioritized. So it might be time to set a healthy boundary there as well. Now, difficult scenarios in the workplace, I'm just going to run through them. Taking on too much work or responsibilities, being expected to do more than you signed up for, being distracted or interrupted by another person when you're trying to work, not being able to say no to a superior or even to a colleague, being asked for a favor by a colleague, personal information being shared, uncomfortable physical contact, giving advice, especially when it's not solicited. All of these are some examples of how boundaries may be, where we may need healthy boundaries and where there is a risk of a boundary violation. Well, here's one place to set a boundary. I found this pretty funny where somebody was trying to convey that they just need to be left alone and not be distracted. Very effective way to put it on their back, but fortunately, we do have other ways to set boundaries. And some of the strategies, again, just running through them. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to share some strategies and then we'll open up the floor to discussion. So set clear expectations with your employer and coworkers around your work hours. As I said, be very specific, be assertive, communicate your needs. Don't make yourself available after work hours. Switch off. So whether it's communicating this with your employer and coworkers that I will not be available after 7:30 p.m. I will not respond to emails. I will not respond to WhatsApp messages. Switch off, right? And that may make you seem rigid or stubborn, but it is important to switch off. Work should have a boundary and should be left to the work hours where you're available. Often what we do is, the trap we fall into is we might respond to a message at 10 p.m., which gives the other person an idea that, hey, they're still responding. Let me just send some more. Let me feed into this pattern. So without even knowing it, we're enabling that pattern, and we want to be able to cut off. Maybe you have a separate phone for work and for WhatsApp. It's something I've definitely done, and I've put my work hours as my status. So it helps others know that, okay, I am sticking to my boundaries here. Now, familiarize yourself with your rights and what you're entitled to in the workplace. such as the policies, the leaves you're entitled to, the work hours. Go through your contract, go through the policies and understand what you are entitled to, because those will also protect your boundaries. Often these contracts do have a lot of thought put into them. The HR does work hard to, come up with these policies to protect the employee. So do familiarize yourself with that. Reflect on how the other person, for example, the superior, responds to your request. Are you feeling heard? Have they understood what you're trying to say? Have they been dismissive? Have they been uncaring? Are they accommodating? This is also a sign of how your boundary is being respected or not. The topic of power imbalance came up earlier. Absolutely, there's power imbalance in this. And so maybe it's thinking about how do we navigate that. Maybe you want to work with your superior, ask for inputs related to your work and build a template, a structure together. Talk to your colleagues, gauge, are they facing similar challenges? Ask yourself, and this is something that's definitely come up in my work, is this the right workplace for you? Is it too much pressure? Is it not allowing you to maintain your boundaries? And ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen if I were to confront the person? And sometimes prepare for it. There may be a backlash, prepare for it, right? One strategy that I find very, very effective is assertive communication using I statements. Focus on the I. Usually we point, turn that inward, be honest, appropriate, reasonable, polite. Simple acronym HARP. And we have some examples here. For example, somebody asks you to come to the office party. You can say, I understand that you would like me to come to this big office party on Friday, but I'm not a very outgoing person and I prefer to be at home with family. Very respectful, very firm. If somebody asks you to work overtime, I need to draw a time boundary here. I will not be available after 7:30 p.m. as I spend time with my parents and or children then. It's something I've definitely done. I have, in fact, it was a while ago, I received a call around 8 p.m. and I was at dinner. Now, what I did is I didn't completely ignore that call. In fact, I picked up the call and they said, hey, I understand there's some work, but if it's urgent, drop me a text. It's outside of work hours right now. I do not work in a crisis setting, so I will respond to it when I'm back at work. I am at dinner with my family right now. And that set a very firm boundary. After that, I haven't received any phone call after 8 p.m. So I'm thinking that maybe worked. And then the third example is, for example, there's a project deadline. As I mentioned earlier, I will work this weekend as a one-off, but this is me extending myself to help and as the deadline is close. So it is important to communicate your stance, your needs, and your position. Now, more useful statements. I'm not comfortable with this. Please don't do that. Not at this time. Can't do that for you. This doesn't work for me. I've decided not to. This is not acceptable. You may even add for me. I am drawing the line at, I don't want to do that. As you notice, it's a respectful way to say no, but it includes the I. It's not ambiguous. It's clear. It says what's not okay for me. Yeah. And finally, during confrontation, this is a topic that came up earlier. When you do confront someone, when you do share your boundaries, you're doing something new. You're being firm, you're being assertive, and not everybody will like that. Chances are you will disappoint someone by standing up for yourself, whether it's in a personal setting, in a social setting, or in a work setting. Part of the work is learning how to accept that disappointment. Okay, they're upset, but I'm glad I set that boundary. Now they know. And the next time they're not going to impose that on me. They're aware of this boundary and they try, it'll be easier for me to continue maintaining and upholding that boundary. So know that there will be challenge, there will be difficult, and in fact, there are a range of things we may feel. The biggest emotions I've seen come up are fear and guilt in trying to place a boundary. There may be the fear of judgment, the log kya kahenge, what will others say? They might think I'm rude or demanding or stubborn, but you know what? Those who understand boundaries will respect that. Hey, I respect her. She's very clear on what she wants. Yeah, he was very clear about that. And I'm glad that he's aligned with that. He's doing exactly what he said. It's a very respectful quality to have. You may fear the loss of friendships. the job, the opportunities. But in fact, if that is how the other is responding, then maybe that's an indication that this is a very stressful environment to be in. If it's at work, for instance, think about, how much time you spend at work. If that's the environment you're in for almost half your day, that's a lot to take on, right? So have to think about that. The fear of abandonment, people will leave you, they'll stop hanging out with you, being labeled disrespectful, demanding, stubborn, facing backlash. Oh, you're wrong. You shouldn't have said that. The guilt tripping, you're terrible to say this. You don't know what you're saying. But if you feel comfortable, if you feel this is confident about what you're saying, how others respond, it's not in your control, and sometimes it's not your concern. You might be blamed, criticized, name called. That's part of the tolerating that we have to do in placing a boundary. And I think we're close to the end. Barriers to being assertive. Why haven't we placed boundaries? Well, it may be a lack of practice, not something we're used to doing. This might be part of your upbringing, part of your experience. There's a lack of confidence, not trusting yourself enough, but we build that confidence when we start placing the boundaries. There may be a lack of positive personal or professional experiences. When you did try to set a boundary, you faced a backlash that was not nice. So we avoid that now. Not wanting to face consequences for our action. There's a fear of that because yes, there may be difficulty that we have to tolerate. And it is the more challenging route. It's easy to stay with the status quo, to continue what you're doing, but probably you're staying overwhelmed, you're staying anxious, and we can do something about that, but it may be the more challenging route. Now, I've worked with one of my clients who I was working on boundaries with. They said, once they placed the boundary and upheld that boundary, they said, I didn't know I can do this, and I like this version of me. So there's this quote from one of my favorite psychologists, Dr. Shauna Shapiro. She says, what I practice grows stronger, and the more we start placing these healthy boundaries, the more confident we become. It becomes a positive feedback loop. It becomes easier. It becomes stronger we become stronger, and we become more able to uphold these boundaries. So yes, there's just this little comic I found today, which I found a little cheeky and funny. So I thought I'd just put it up there. You look incredible. You look confident. What's your secret? Boundaries. So boundaries, secret to being aligned, being confident, being content. And feel free to reach out to me on my email address provided here, info@drmiloni.com. If you have any questions, if you would like to just drop in and say hi, that you are here, I'd love to hear your feedback. Any questions you have, happy to answer them. But I think we'll open up the floor to any questions. We have around 10 minutes. So I will stop sharing and we'll open it to the floor.
So, Doctor, thank you so much for the session. Very, very helpful, and I think quite insightful rather. I have a question here, and this to me sounds a little tricky. When you talk about boundaries, you're also trying to relate vulnerability to it, and this is specifically in context to workplace, right? So how do you decide to what extent, because you share different sort of relationship with every individual at workplace, right? Then it gets difficult at times because you're also human, and you also, because most of the time that you spend of your life is in the office, right? So how do you correlate vulnerabilities or being vulnerable to setting boundaries? I've not been able to get answer to this myself, so I just thought I'll leverage this session to ask.
Sure. Thank you for asking that question. And perhaps just for a bit more clarity so that I can answer this more accurately, when you talk about vulnerability, is it a vulnerability to set a boundary, or is it a vulnerability you're experiencing and that's difficult to communicate for you?
So I think first, vulnerability in terms of setting up the boundaries, right? Because you have to be comfortable with that first before you communicate it to others. So it's like registering that in your head first, right? So once that happens, and it's a process that one has to put up with. But after that, when you know that there are boundaries, and there would be times when it'll be for you itself, it'll be difficult to keep those boundaries. There may be chance that you might just not be able to keep it yourself. So that's where you're just being vulnerable, right? And and you're circumstanced. Nobody does it out of choice. So you're circumstanced. How do you decide to what extent you want to be vulnerable at work, right? How do you decide that what I should not be sharing and what I should be sharing with colleagues? Sometimes things just come out in the flow. But yes, there is a high possibility. And this question comes from being misinterpreted a lot of times, because the way you're communicating, it is not perceived that way, right? Then it leads to all the other things.
Okay. Thank you for that question and elaborating on that. Fantastic question. I think the answer will touch upon various points. And thank you for being vulnerable in asking that question as well. It's not easy to put yourself out there, so I really appreciate that. A few things that came to mind when you were asking about this and asking about vulnerability specifically was, first of all, honesty. We want to think about being authentic when we're setting a healthy boundary. You want to come from a place of not saying a white lie to protect yourself or saying something just for the sake of covering up. But if you are feeling vulnerable, for example, you might say something like, hey, I'm not feeling totally okay. I don't want to talk about it too much, but I just need some space. And that brings us to this, concept of space and time, just asking for that, right? So that you can process, you can take that time to understand what's going on for you. So saying something very vague is also something that can be respected. Hey, just give me some time, just give me some space. I'm not feeling quite right. I'm not feeling great. Yeah, just give me some time to figure it out, right? That might be something that you ask. Compassion is a very important factor here. Being compassionate with yourself. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to not have a smile on your face every day. It's okay to feel a bit low or to feel weaker or sometimes to feel like you've failed or not succeeded at something. It's okay. And remind yourself of that message, right? Hey, it's okay. If you've shared something and you're feeling a bit vulnerable there, hey, it's okay. Tell yourself it's okay, you're doing your best, right? And in terms of sort of communicating what to share, what not to share, we talked about the planning ahead and talked about sort of setting those limits. That might be a mindful and reflective activity for you to take back. Okay, what are the things I want to share at work? And in fact, that thinking might come from something you've shared and you're like, wait, that was a bit too much. Right? So we go back home, we think, wait a second, what have I done? But rather than criticizing ourselves or belittling ourselves and letting that, internal critic take over, it's like, okay, I did that, I understand, but how can I change things? How can I set those healthy boundaries, right? So be authentic, be vague if you need to, that's absolutely okay. Be compassionate towards yourself, plan and set your limits, right? I hope that.
Yeah, that does. And I have a follow-up question. I'm sorry, I'm hijacking the stage right now, but it's an important one, and I'm sure a lot of people will be able to relate to it. At workplace, you're expected to be a lot more diplomatic, right? So how do you again correlate being diplomatic to all of this? Because when you are trying to be authentic, of course, your communication matters a lot, right? But it is not just about you communicating, it is also about the other person being able to understand it, right? And that is where the challenge will begin to happen. And that is where things will begin to go wrong, because they would perceive it in a manner, let's say today I'm comfortable with someone and suddenly I realize that I need to set my boundaries from tomorrow. And the moment I start doing that, one, I think in my mind, what I'm processing right now while talking to you, one, I am changing my mind in seconds, not thinking about the other person, the impact that it may have on them, right? Or I am expecting too much from the other person, because that is how I may think if somebody does this to me, right? So setting it up in a manner that you're being compassionate with others too and with yourself too, right? That could be the personal aspect, but how you be so diplomatic at the same time, right, in communicating that, hey, this is not acceptable, because people feel that you're becoming way too direct, and that is when you start aloofing yourself from the crowd as well, and you're the one who's standing out.
Yeah, great question. Again, rather than just distancing yourself, maybe we have to get closer to it a bit and explore what's going on. And that's where the I statement really comes, it becomes helpful and becomes necessary that, hey, okay, I understand people feel about this differently. I feel a bit unsure about this, so I'm going to step away, right? I don't feel this is acceptable. I'm going to step away. You do what you like, right? So it's about that I again. What's your position in relation to this? Being able to reflect on that, communicate that I'm not comfortable with this. It might be a personal thing. This is not a topic I really want to engage in. I don't think this is nice for somebody else, right? And being able to express that. And then, as I said, tolerating whatever comes your way, because that's not in your control. So you mentioned expectation from the other person. I think that's some work we really have to do, because if we're expecting something from someone else, and if that expectation is not met, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, right? And we doubt ourselves then. So not expecting from the other. Sometimes you might predict what they say. Sometimes it's not pleasant. And all of that happens as part of boundary setting. But when you set a boundary, when you're able to communicate that boundary, the sense you get is of confidence, of that sort of relief, of that sense of command. Okay, I did this, and this is my voice.
Yeah. It's a lot to make peace with as well at the same time.
It is. And in that
It's a process.
Exactly. In that example where somebody was calling, the individual to an office party, it's like, hey, I get that you would like me to come, but, I want to stay back. I'm actually introverted. I'm actually, have other plans, or have the time off for myself. So you respect what the other person wants. They have, this emotional excitement as well, perhaps, but you acknowledge that, you respect that, and then you communicate your position.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm aware it's 5 p.m., but if okay, can I take one more question that's in the chat?
Yes,
Yeah? Okay.
There are a couple of questions on the chat.
Right, yes. We have a few comments as well. I have this one question. How would you recommend as a media to determining boundaries so that they come across as assertive but not aggressive? This is where compassion plays a huge role. Be very careful and mindful about your language. You want to acknowledge, you want to respect, you want to appreciate, you want to empathize with the other person, saying that you're on the same team, you're not versus the other person, saying, I get it, we're here. I understand you would like this. I acknowledge that this is what you're feeling, but here's what it is for me, right? So it's coming across very compassionate, very respectful, giving that other person a voice as well, saying, I understand you're speaking about this, but here's my stance. So you're not, oh, you did this, but I did this. It's, you're here. Maybe I would like to do that, but I'm not quite there yet, and I need to set that boundary. Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. I think the others are comments. It's good to set boundaries for yourself before you set for others. That helps you improve the value, bring self-respect. I think, yes, this is a great summary of things we've discussed. And if we're all right, I'm happy to end here. Before we do, I just want to say a huge thank you for turning up today and for your interactions. A lot of learning for me as well. Wonderful. Thank you for asking your questions. Thank you for sharing your reflections. I've really enjoyed today, and I hope that you have as well, and you've got something out of this.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you so much. And with that, we end the conversation. Sorry for taking additional time, but I think it was worth it. Doctor, we have learned lots today about setting boundaries. I think, as you rightly said, it's a process. And I think we have to keep doing it. We have to just keep doing it. It's okay. And Akshi asked some really nice question. I think, first of all, we should stop judging what others are going to, judging ourselves from others' lenses. I think that we have to stop doing for ourselves first. We always think, what would the person think about me?
I think it's also about being okay with others being uncomfortable with your boundaries. Maybe that's the starting point.
I think she spoke about that it's not going to be comfortable. First start accepting that that's going to be uncomfortable.
If I were to talk about myself, I start with affirmations that it's okay. And then I go about it, make little, take one step at a time, little progress, and then it's fine.
All right. I think Hitesh has something to add here.
Yes, madam, the presentation is available to us, ma'am?
I'm happy to share. This is on with the organization. How would we go about? Do you want to email me and I could reply with the presentation? You have my email
We
address.
can
So
share our email ID to you if you are comfortable and KelpHR don't have any issue, right? So we request you to share this wonderful presence to all the participants. This will be great help to us.
absolutely. And thank you for asking that question rather than demanding it. That is a healthy boundary that you are respecting. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from here, from each other. If it helps, I'm very happy to share it. So absolutely. If you could just drop me an email on the email address I shared, I'm going to drop it in the chat as well. And I will respond with the slide.
With kind consent of KelpHR representative, right, ma'am? If you do not have any objection for this.
Sure.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. And I'll hand over to you guys again at KelpHR.
Thank you. I think we'll close the session. Thank you very much, all of you.
आ जाओ बस